Time now to move on to our next session, which is a conversation about inclusion, rights and ethics. Of course, these are some of the key themes at the core of our digital transition, digital poverty, digital marginalization. We know all of these. We know about all of these issues, don't we, within the wider subject. These are some of the issues going to be dealt with in this panel. It's a panel that is moderated by Alice Charles. And let me introduce Alice to you, and then she will take you through the members of her panel. So I reckon that we can expect a very interesting debate on one of the key issues affecting us today. Where is Alice? Alice, please come through and introduce your panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Alice Charles from the World Economic Forum. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this session on inclusion, rights and ethics at the core of digital transformation, and welcome to our audience who are also joining us online. So first, let me introduce you to our esteemed panelists. First, I'd like to introduce you to Governor Correa. He's the governor of Antioquia, Colombia, and indeed the former mayor of Medellin. Secondly, I'd like to introduce you to Mrs. Fatima Barkan, who's the director of the Women Department, Ministry of Solidarity, Social Inclusion and Family from the government of Morocco, and she is joining us online, and you'll see her in just a second. Thirdly, I'd like to welcome Ms. Renata Avila, who's the CEO of the Open Knowledge Foundation. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Mr. Jeremy Goldberg, who's the Worldwide Director of Critical Infrastructure at Microsoft. You're all very welcome. Thank you.
This is the hot seat.
So, first of all, just before we get started, let me set the scene a little bit about this session. The COVID-19 pandemic has drawn attention to, and indeed sometimes worsened, the stark inequalities that we face in our cities and countries around the world. The resilience of cities and countries to crises like the pandemic depends on their ability to enhance inclusion through spatial, economic, social, institutional, and digital transformation. Turning to digital inclusion has become vital for access to services in our cities and countries. Whether it's education, health, employment, this has certainly been the case during COVID-19. However, different groups of urban and indeed rural residents, women, low-income residents, ethnic and religious minorities, disabled persons, migrants, indigenous people, refugees, older persons, children and youth, and others face specific barriers to urban and, in particular, digital inclusion. To achieve greater inclusion, cities and national governments must understand and respond to the unique vulnerabilities faced by these different groups and segments of our population, as well as the ways in which these vulnerabilities intersect. For example, 1/3 of the world's school children, so that's 463 million people, were unable to access remote learning due to inadequate technology, digital infrastructure, and conditions at home during the pandemic. In the US alone, there are nearly 30 million people with no high-speed internet access, and 40% of tribal lands have no connectivity or basic wireless services. Globally, women are 23% less likely than men to use mobile internet, and some 327 million fewer women than men have a smartphone. Nearly half of the world remains unconnected. In developing countries, a mere 35% of the population has broadband access. Yet, raising internet penetration to 75% in developing countries would result in an additional $2 trillion being added to their GDP and create at least 140 million jobs. Bolstering mobile broadband is also important and particularly relevant in Africa, where it is the primary method of digital access. Despite this undeniable need to close the digital divide, information and communications technology coverage lags in less developed countries. Even in developed countries, many rural citizens lack access to internet services. The situation thereby propagates a chasm between the connected and the unconnected. It is the digital divide. However, access means nothing if service is not affordable. The United Nations target for affordable internet is 2% of monthly income for 1 gigabyte of data. Unfortunately, there are strong global disparities. For example, in Argentina, it may be less than 1% of the monthly GNP per capita, whereas in Zimbabwe, it's more than 10%. Investing in digital infrastructure alone is not enough. 23% of adults internationally are not digitally literate. Educational institutions must embed digital skills in everyday curriculum. But technology is not the end-all solution. Political and societal support are needed to create a mindset to support digital rights and form impactful partnerships. Digital infrastructure is but an enabler. Without the right policies, institutions, and regulations, cities and governments will not leverage the benefits of technology. Ensuring equitable access to digital technologies must also be advanced by governments through well-defined policies, regulations, and investments. Also, issues need to be addressed, including data privacy, surveillance, collateral uses, which emphasize the importance of the right governance in place to leverage digital infrastructure benefits. Cities and governments can enhance digital inclusion by ensuring reliable access to the internet, affordable devices, digital skills training, and supporting digital rights. And that's what we will be exploring in today's session. In particular, we will be focused on how can the digital transition be advanced while ensuring inclusive societies, digital rights, and the ethical use of data. And in terms of format, we will be hearing the perspectives of our esteemed panelists who will provide their vision. And then we will have a question and answer session, and indeed bring in your questions from the audience. There are mics, as you will see, scattered through the room, and you are most welcome to include your comments and questions. So first, without further ado, I'm going to turn to Mrs. Fatima Barkan, who's the Director of the Women Department, Ministry of Solidarity, Social Inclusion and Family from the Government of Morocco, who is going to give us her perspective on how the digital transition can be advanced whilst ensuring inclusive societies, digital rights, and the ethical use of data. Fatima, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Alice, Charles, chair of this session, dear Governor of Antioquia, Colombia, dear Mr. Renata Avila, CEO Open Knowledge Foundation, dear Mr. Jeremy Goldberg, Worldwide Director of Critical Infrastructure at Microsoft. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, allow me to present the apologies of the Minister, Professor Awatif Hayar, Minister of Solidarity, Social Integration and Family in Morocco, who was unable to be with you today. Given her interest and commitment to these issues, she has appointed me to represent her at this event. And allow me to read her speech. And this is her speech to this event. Before starting, allow me to express my joy in participating in this session of Smart City Expo World Congress, which focuses on the theme inclusion rights at the core of the digital transition. I am particularly thrilled to see this webinar gather such a large group of participants from different settings from all over the world. I am glad to represent the Ministry of Solidarity, Social Integration and Family at this international event and the project Casablanca EA Core Smart City. Indeed, the concept of social smart city Casablanca was developed by researchers from University Hassan II of Casablanca and integrated in the development projects of the city of Casablanca focuses on putting citizens in the center of the city digital transition. It aims at engaging citizens to adopt digital transformation and promote human capital empowerment, making them being the main actors of their smart city transformation. It is clear that the interest of the smart city has clearly grown, and even more so with the advent of the COVID-19, which has brought an exceptional volume of challenges and contrasts, especially for vulnerable social categories. It's during a pandemic that the concepts of resilience and inclusion have been taken on particular resonance. Indeed, this unprecedented crisis underlined the imperative need to build a resilient, inclusive city capable of facing the different challenges, especially unemployment and isolation of people suffering aging, disabilities, and handicap. Indeed, accompanying, qualifying, and training the local human capital has proved to be a key factor of resilience to face the crisis, and also to hope to take a place in the circle of nations that count and aspire to prosperity, as it was underlined in the recommendations of the last report of Special Commission of the new department model created by His Majesty King Mohammed VI, may God assist him. More than ever, the digital transformation has been seen as a key process to increase inclusion benefiting from digital online canals, to maintain continuity of public services, provided that equitable access is secured for all and strengthening the resilience of the city as demonstrated since the beginning of this pandemic, which has distributed the mode of operation and uses worldwide. Taking on the digital road is no longer a luxury, but rather an important level for territorial inclusion and resilience. Far from limiting this notion to digital governance, inclusion cannot be gained without citizen implication and the dynamic social innovation, which allows them to capitalize on collective intelligence and acquire the intrinsic capacity to adapt to the changes required to find innovative solutions and build a resilient system. Example from ministry's program, our ministry as a platform that offer distance learning for and educational kits that allow a large population to benefit from these services, such as autism online education kit for people with this disability and their family, and the ATMKIN, which means empowerment, which will offer services for women entrepreneurs in the form of a digital counter. Thus, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, through this example of a concrete illustration, we are already in the smart city, frugal and inclusive. I think there will be a before and after COVID-19, of course, and that is why I invite all actors to cities and territories to combine their efforts and energies to make their city vibrant and to create a resilient and sustainable innovation ecosystem, inclusive and sustainable. Before closing my remark, let me thank you once again for your interest in our experience, and I am convinced that such knowledge sharing platform is an ideal opportunity to share best practices from worldwide and surely bring a valuable contribution to the construction of a better city for tomorrow, which needs to be connected, resilient, inclusive, and frugal. Thank you, and this is the end of the minister's speech. I am at your disposal if there is any information or a question. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Fatima. We will come back to you shortly with questions. But next, I'd like to turn to the Governor. Governor, I'd love to hear your perspective on how the digital transition can be advanced whilst ensuring inclusive societies, digital rights, and the ethical use of data. Governor, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Alice. Un saludo a mis compañeros de panel, a Fátima, a Renata, a Jeremy y a todos los presentes. Yo creo que la pregunta de este panel es, digamos, para mí central en el concepto de Smart Cities, porque nosotros desde Medellin, desde Antioquia, estamos convencidos que el gran reto de la humanidad es la desigualdad, la inequidad. La humanidad ha avanzado en forma increíble en muchísimos aspectos. Hoy la humanidad tiene la capacidad de construir infraestructuras en años, en meses, que antes se podría demorar cientos de años. En la etapa del medioevo se demoraban 100, 200, 300 años en construir una catedral que hoy se puede hacer con las tecnologías de construcción y los capitales en a lo mejor un año o aún menos. La pregunta importante es las grandes herramientas que hoy la tecnología y la humanidad puede construir y está construyendo. ¿Cómo hacen para disminuir las desigualdades que son iguales o mayores que las que teníamos hace 2 o 3 milenios? El gran reto es la desigualdad. Y la tecnología puede jugar entonces un papel trascendental en profundizar las desigualdades o en disminuirlas. Y ese es para nosotros el gran reto. Hay herramientas tecnológicas que han generado revoluciones que tal vez son tan evidentes que no entendemos claramente. Hace 20, 25, 30 años, por lo menos en Colombia, en nuestro país, en América Latina, pero creo que buena parte del mundo, solo un porcentaje mínimo de personas tenía la capacidad de acceder, por ejemplo, a llamadas internacionales. Hoy lo puede hacer cualquier persona desde cualquier parte del mundo. Comunicarse desde Colombia en una región rural remota con España, con Nueva York, un familiar en la China. Eso ha hecho una revolución de la equidad. Pero igualmente subsisten muchas desigualdades en términos tecnológicos, empezando, por ejemplo, por una básica. Hoy, más o menos 940 millones de personas en el mundo no tienen acceso a la electricidad, que es obviamente básica para acceder a cualquiera de las otras herramientas tecnológicas de las que estamos hablando y que estamos viendo en Smart Cities. Entonces, el mensaje que queremos dejar es la tecnología, las Smart Cities, como herramienta básica para construir o para profundizar desigualdades. Y en ese sentido los gobiernos tenemos una tarea fundamental, que tú, Alice, de alguna manera esbozabas en las líneas generales de la presentación del panel, y es por lo menos trabajar intensamente en 3 frentes. En que todas las personas en las ciudades y en las regiones rurales, que será otra historia, tengan la posibilidad del acceso físico a las tecnologías. En segundo lugar, que tengan la capacidad del acceso económico a las tecnologías. Y en tercer lugar, que tengan la capacidad y el conocimiento y la educación para poder aprovecharlas adecuadamente. Creo que ahí hay 3 pilares de la acción de los gobiernos con políticas públicas que garanticen esos 3 puertas de acceso a los beneficios tecnológicos y a la equidad que la tecnología puede darnos en las ciudades y en general en las sociedades.
Thank you very much for your comments, Governor. I'm now going to turn to Renata to give her vision.
Thank you. My vision will be like probably not what you're expecting. Probably you're expecting to hear from me, oh yes, privacy and cybersecurity and rights. But that's super important. But something that I find often missing in the conversation today is a positive vision and a positive agenda of the digital future we want. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what at the Open Knowledge Foundation we are working on every day. We firmly believe in the possibilities of a free, fair, and open digital future. And that is not only with restrictions or with banning the use of certain technologies, but in parallel, we need to create and make possible the digital society that we want to see. And the interesting thing is that you might think that the key element is connectivity or that the key element is data privacy. Actually, the key element is people. And that's the departing point for us. all our agenda is people-centric and that's our departing point. That's where we allocate most of the resources and time, and that's the building block of a better digital society. And it is not only the user. It is a citizen entitled to create and to connect and to create collectively a possible digital future. And one of the things that we do is, and one of the departing points is like we do not only see, do not only work with civil society organizations or people outside the governments. Key part of building this possible digital future that is ethical and that is enabling to all members of society is to start to work with the government closely. And one of the things that we have found is that there's a lot of talking, a lot of yes, ethics and digital, or yes, datified society. And at the end of the day, the translation in any given city is just a program that just two people inside the municipality can understand, and nobody has any idea of what's going on inside, or what it is that for. There's a proliferation of techno-solutionism, and we tend to think, and that I think that the COVID crisis was a clear example that there will be a magic app or a magic technology that will solve our problems. We go, 20 steps before that. Basically, what we are trying to build is the data literacies installed in the people, even before the technologies arrive, so they can understand the whys, the what for, and the what if, how can we make it better. And that's the kind of things that we do with governments. But also we deliver to them tools to then, when they understand why data and why digital and all the possibilities, they can start creating their own things inside and experimenting, but not alone, but connecting, plugging citizens into the process. And some of the aspects that are often neglected and that our colleague from Morocco mentioned is the cultural aspects of the digital transformation. We often, and in this kind of fora, we talk about the economic dimension and financial inclusion, but what about culture? What about expression? What about all the possibilities of connecting and thinking about technology as a creative collective process that involves all members of society? That's I think that's the in all these surveillance, control, restrictions, conversations that we are here, violations of freedom of expression, invasions of my privacy, propaganda, all of this, we need to think at a higher level and build together in our cities a vision, collectively, a vision that includes citizens as creators and digital culture as some factor of cohesion. But that cannot happen alone. That cannot happen, spontaneously. Political will is needed. So in part of the ethics is not only an ethics of restricting, but an ethics of investing and enabling that participatory digital infrastructure that will bring us to a different digital future that is more fun, let's say, and more enabling to all members in society.
Thank you very much for that, Renata. And Jeremy?
Thank you. So you completely flipped the script as well on me, because I had a whole idea of what I wanted to start out with here. Your point about the magic app, all right, let's say, or could kind of call it an easy button. And for all of us up here, we know that the last 18 plus months, it's been anything short of easy, and it's not getting easier either. We still have a lot of these questions and big problems to solve that are related to accessibility, digital divide, but really the human component and dimension of connecting with people. And next month will be 1 year, which is hard to believe, since leaving my role in government. I represented the governor of the state of New York as the Deputy Secretary for Technology. served in that capacity and role during the first wave of the COVID pandemic. And let me share with you that during that first wave of the pandemic in New York, there were some very obvious issues around access. And I mean, there's the physical environment that we talk about, there's the digital issues that we talk about, and in particular, the processes that are in place today that make it almost impossible for families, for people, for parents to get the services that they deserve from government. For example, in some cases, when an individual is seeking benefits for his or their family, and they have to fax in a form during the pandemic, it goes into an empty office, and it sits there for months. And that individual depends upon that money to provide for their family. We know that the digitizing of government forms, let's say, or documents doesn't go far enough. The digitalization of the way that we operate and the way that government delivers, the process, the policies, those things have to match. The technology is only as good as the people process that are a part of this. And so when we think about this moment that we have, which is a once-in-a-generation moment with the EU response and resiliency recovery funds, the IIJA that passed in the United States, all of these big infrastructure investments that are happening, we have a moment to strategically invest in the technology, in the digital platforms, all of that wonderful possibility that enables digital transformation, but the skilling, the training, the educational components that are core to this. And finally, the other piece to really make sure that we underscore and we take a more proactive posture on is accessibility as it relates to those people who are living with disabilities, to the elderly, to people with families who are pushing strollers through a city. What are we doing to ensure that the built environment that they live in is built for them, not just for a segment of the population or people, not a retrofitting of the existing infrastructure, but truly something that 50 years from now, when we look back, we'll know that we seized this moment for accessibility and inclusion to take care of the people that matter the most in our world, which is our friends, our families, and our colleagues around the globe.
It's such a good point. We were actually just talking about this backstage, weren't we? That, you know, often in the discussions around inclusion, disabled people are often left out of the conversation. And one of the things we talked about is at some point in our lives, all of us will be disabled in some way, shape or form, whether it's temporarily, you know, breaking our leg or whether it's more permanent. But I guess often when people aren't at the table, they're not part of the solution finding, right? So I wanted to build on that just a little bit more in terms of thinking about how does government best capture the wider benefits of digital transformation without leaving anyone behind. And I think we've just, you know, hit upon a group that's very vulnerable to being excluded, not just digitally, but also, you know, spatially, economically, socially, etc. Fatima, I'd love your perspective on, you know, how government can best capture the wider benefits of digital transformation without leaving anybody behind.
Yes, I will thank you for the question, and I will tell you about Moroccan experience. As you know, Morocco, we had, excuse me, I'm in my office. Someone is phoning. Excuse me. In Morocco, we had a very huge program. We called it PACT, what is to resolve blank area. What is blank area is spaces where we haven't any GSM or internet, the minimum of the connection. And we identified 6,000 localities in Morocco. And the objective and the method is that the operator, the telecom operator, we have the three big operators in Morocco. We had a fund and we asked them to go to this, to resolve these blank areas. And if it is possible, because these localities were in mountains or Sahara, or some localities where we have difficulties to access to these localities. And if the operators didn't do the job, they must bring to this fund 1% of their benefits. And it is the government will go and give these localities this universal services, that is the basic. And after we had this stage in Morocco to develop infrastructure, fiber optic and other infrastructure in Morocco, and it allowed us to be able to have this transition in the context of COVID. It was very important because we had this infrastructure and we didn't see the transition because we had to have some courses for students, for people to work online, and we had the infrastructure to do it, and we didn't have some problems. But the question, as you said, to not leave anyone behind, the SDGs objective or vision, is that how people are using this infrastructure or this access to smart cities or these services on the web, and how it is useful for family and for persons and community, because we had statistics about this use and access to these infrastructures. We had an agency, national agency for reglementation, which had an observatory, and we have statistics. I give you just one example for women. Their access to smartphone is 87% of women in Morocco have their own smartphone. But the question is how they use the smartphone. Is it just for chat, for WhatsApp or other platform, or to use and to access to marketplace and to have a job and to access to some economical empowerment what's offered by the government? I think that I answered the question. If you have
Thank you for that. I think it's such an important point. It's not just developing solutions, but actually auditing the use of those solutions to see how useful they are for those that you design them for, right? So I want to turn to you, Governor, as well. Of course, you're also the former mayor of Medellin, and Medellin is world famous for what it's done to create a more inclusive city. So I'd love your perspective on, how we can ensure that we governments are best capturing the benefits of digital transformation without leaving anybody behind.
Sí, veamos de pronto más fácil con algunos ejemplos de lo que hemos hecho en Antioquia y también lo que hemos hecho en Medellín, que van en la dirección de los tres elementos que mencionaba ahora, del acceso físico, del acceso económico y la capacitación para el acceso a las tecnologías. Todo eso enmarcado en una necesidad absoluta para que eso funcione, que es una voluntad política, una decisión política de los gobiernos para que esa sea una inversión prioritaria dentro de los recursos limitados que siempre tenemos los gobiernos. Entonces, hablaba ahora, por ejemplo, de ese bache universal que hay en el acceso a la electricidad. Nosotros en Antioquia empezamos y desarrollamos un programa hacia el año 2004-2005 que se desarrolló por más o menos 10 años para llevar la conexión con electricidad a todos los rincones de Antioquia. Antioquia es un departamento de 6,5 millones de habitantes, 63,000 kilómetros cuadrados, 125 municipios. De ellos, Medellín es la capital, con 2,5 millones de habitantes y un área metropolitana de 4 millones. Pero si a esos 4 millones le restas la cifra total, tenemos 2,5 millones de habitantes en municipios muy lejanos, municipios muy apartados que no tenían ese acceso a la electricidad, primera base. Ahora tenemos un programa de llevar Internet a todas las escuelas rurales de los municipios de Antioquia. Esa es una prioridad dentro de el concepto de acceso, pero también capacitación. Entonces, son más o menos entre 2,000 y 2,500 escuelas rurales a las que estamos en este momento llevando Internet, pero además eso tiene que ir aunado con una capacitación de todo el personal y sobre todo de los profesores para llevar el acceso de capacitación a los niños. Y un tercer frente es el programa denominado Antioquia LED, que es ya enfocado a las cabeceras de los municipios urbanos, de los municipios rurales pequeños. En esas cabeceras estamos de alguna manera llevando lo que se hizo en buena parte de Medellín, llevando, por supuesto, la última tecnología en iluminación, que es un concepto muy ligado al de las ventanas rotas de Nueva York. Los problemas de seguridad están supremamente impulsados y estimulados por la oscuridad. La oscuridad invita al delito, la iluminación lo previene. Entonces, estamos hablando de una iluminación para mejorar la seguridad, para prevenir el delito, pero una iluminación también acorde con los estándares del cambio climático, un tema integral. Pero adicionalmente, con ese programa de Antioquia LED estamos llevando internet público a esas cabeceras municipales, cámaras de seguridad, cámaras inteligentes de control de la movilidad y de apoyo a la movilidad. Y para no dejar el tema de Medellín, aunque no en el aspecto digital, pero sí compartir uno que ha sido uno de los, digamos, íconos del desarrollo de Medellín, que es el sistema de transporte de cables, y allí hablar de la, digamos, de la esencia de la innovación. Nosotros no inventamos los cables existían por más de 100 años en Europa, en los Alpes, en muchos, pero los convertimos la primera ciudad en el mundo en el acceso a las zonas de alta montaña de la ciudad, de un transporte público amigable con el medio ambiente, económico, seguro, digno. Entonces, eso del cable y del transporte en clave del concepto de equidad y del concepto de inclusión en todos los desarrollos tecnológicos.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point because, we're talking about digital inclusion, but equally spatial inclusion, economic inclusion, social inclusion, and institutional inclusion is imperative as part of your overall city strategy. And of course, your example of the cable car network in Medellin enabled people to have economic opportunity as well, right? So it's a fantastic example. If I could turn to you, Jeremy, just from the private sector's perspective, I know you're from Microsoft, you can just represent the whole of the private sector here in this discussion, but perhaps you could tell us, how you can develop solutions that meet the unique needs and context of a city or a country, but also puts the needs of citizens at their heart. How are you going about that in Microsoft and generally in the private sector?
Thank you for the question. Since we're in person, I'll use this moment to ask the audience a question, which is, how many of you work in technology? How many of you represent companies? Just by show of hands. Okay. So I worked in 3 mayor's offices and for a governor. And any person that's worked in government will tell you that when you show up to sell your product, when you show up to help solve a problem, please come and empathize and try to help solve the problem. Now, this might get me into a little bit of trouble. I mean, again, I do work for a tech company, of course, but the lesson and the explanation that I try to give with the teams that I work with across Microsoft is to check your technology at the door. When you arrive to a city hall or you arrive to an agency, right, working with a government, come in with at least a bit of the decency to say, let's talk about the issues today that you're facing. What are some immediate problems that we can help you to fix? And of course, there's a vision and an opportunity for the future to partner on longer range plans. But in most instances, and in fact, especially during the pandemic, there are far too many things that need to be solved and done today that we can't and we haven't found the time to figure out what the future yet looks like. So when I look at how the private sector can help and really dive in and come at it much more from a people-centered a focus and put people at the forefront of the work, I'd like to give this example. When I worked for the city of New York, we were running a moonshot challenge through NYCX. And the challenge that we articulated was both technology and business, a new business model. The focus was on fast charging EV solutions, both the technology that could be available, made available to support the city fleet of vehicles, and at the same time, a business plan for rolling out those technologies across the city. And we were sitting in a workshop with one of the companies that was proposing their solution. And my former colleague at the city, who was the commissioner for the mayor's office with people with disabilities, Victor Khaleesi, said, so how do you expect for that cable to go from the car to the light pole, right? Tell me a bit more about that process. Have we thought through what this means in terms of the sidewalk, the use of space in a very densely urban populated area, like a place like New York City, where there's already quite a bit of street furniture? Have we thought about it from the perspective of the person, all people in a place? So I really challenge the teams and the people that I work with across Microsoft that if we're going to be that trusted partner to government, that we come at it from a problem-solving focus and with the empathy to really approach government as a partner and truly unpack the problems that we want to solve today and the future.
It's such an important point because I guess, for too long, if we think about what's happened in the smart cities arena over the last sort of 20 years, there was quite a big focus on widgets and gadgets coming out of the tech sector rather than what citizens actually wanted in particular cities. So it's great to hear that you're coming at it the other way now.
There's limited time, right? Very limited time. And there's increasing expectation due to the pandemic, due to lots of different variables that are, things happening in our lives, that we don't have the time to waste on the things that are nice to haves. And that was said before. Many people have probably heard that phrase at this expo in the past, but truly today there isn't time to waste. And the more we're focused on the true problem solving, which sometimes it is technology, sometimes it's not, that's where we ought to really be dedicating our time and focus going forward.
Great. So it's very much focused on outcomes, the outcomes that citizens want, and you're developing the solutions. If I could turn to Renata, of course, you work with the private sector, you work with government. I'd love to get your perspective on how you can assist government and the private sector in developing the policy and the solutions that are inclusive and that support digital rights and the ethical use of data.
The problem I think that it is that, private sector is driven by profit, and their mission is to not to, have a successful business. Then the government with government, two things happen: electoral cycles, and then driven by many times austerity and efficiency. And I think that's and the combination of both is a good relationship. Sometimes, like a company saves a lot of money for a municipality and they deliver. They deliver, that's what they say, they deliver. But on the other side, there's a human, there's a society, there's a community with a specific culture and values embedded. And I think that when the digital transformation is only, the protagonists are only private sector and the government, and the citizens are left out of it, it becomes just delivery of some things that sometimes work, sometimes they don't work, but they don't really belong to the communities. So I think that the challenges that we are facing now is, where is the digital social innovation in society? So the rich part of our culture, the rich part of our community dynamics can be brought to the digital space. And we keep making the mistake of thinking that digital lives in our telephones or laptops or tablets. Digital now is everywhere. It's a space that we can occupy. It's a space. Is an element that we can use as a tool of expression. And a very interesting example of Barcelona is in the Center of Contemporary Culture. I love it because it is the city made available, enable a space for young people to come over, and you see by the end of the day, every time you see skaters, and you see people rehearsing dance, and you see people like doing things and painting and doing a lot of creative activity. It was enabled by the municipality. It was probably sponsored by some private sector, but it was occupied by the citizens, especially young citizens making something fun out of it. I want the same thing to happen with digital. I want the digital transformation to be a creative process where there's, ownership and empowerment and expression from the young, from the old, from the different. And I think that a successful example of the pandemic was how, even with very limited resources and with very limited budgets, galleries, museums, and cultural institutions, they took over, and they fill a gap that was not that was not delivery, that was not efficiency, but that was that little window to a concert or watching a performance of the theater remotely even, or connecting to the human aspects of our local societies. And it was a very important lesson because we were limited thinking that the possibilities of culture and public cultural events, for example, were only the possibilities of a space like this. Right now, for example, we are seeing that the possibilities expanded. We are innovating in ways to be engaging in different forms of cultural expression. And I think that of course, and it shouldn't be the prerogative of only rich cities like Barcelona. It should be that participatory element where citizens can reimagine the spaces and incorporate digital as not only something for basic economic needs, but basic and advanced cultural needs is urgently needed, and a priority that should be at the top of any digitization process. It's not only education, it's not only economic advancement, it's cultural advancement, and it is also something that is its own, and it is enjoyed by citizens.
Yeah, completely agree. And just, a number of you have touched upon it, but just to sort of, very, very briefly, I'd love to get your perspective on how the public-private sectors, civil society and academia can better work together. One of the things I'm very conscious of is the financial position of city government and national government. Like if we think about, you mentioned New York, so maybe let's look at New York. New York had a budget deficit of about 9 billion last year. It lost revenue in relation to car parking charges, taxes, sales taxes, property taxes. So, the budgetary situation of cities and governments is very, very difficult right now. So they're naturally looking for ways to deliver digital transformation without investing a huge amount of money from the city side. So they're going to be looking at new ways of collaborating with the public and private sector. And of course, some of them are, we've already seen these revenue share models where they have a partnership perhaps with the city's police authority, and you have surveillance technology across the city, and if they see somebody committing a crime, then a fine is issued towards that person, and the city and the provider of the infrastructure shares that revenue 50-50, but there's also problems associated with that. So thinking about those types of future scenarios, I'd love to get your thoughts on how you think the public and private sector and civil society need to work together to deliver digital transformation, yet ensure it's inclusive. And perhaps I start with Fatima. I'd love your perspective.
Thank you. And just to talk about the fourth P, what is the people partnership, private sectors, and with people. And this is our method for collaboration with even civil societies and even territorial collectivities. because as you know, in Morocco in 2015 we had a new laws, organic laws that fixed and give with very precision the attribution of every level of territorial collectivities, regions, provinces, and commune. And thus, we have some missions that are involved in territorial level, like digital infrastructure or smart cities, to give more territorial, smart territorial in general. And I can give you just some example. For example, for Casablanca, what is the champion in Morocco for as a smart city, I told about it. And Rabat, what is also the capital of lights, but we have a lot of connection infrastructure, like the public transport. We have cameras, and you use it to have, for example, safe cities for women, to protect them from violence and other problems that they can encounter in the streets. That is an example of partnership between the government, the territorial level, and the civil societies. And I don't know if I have time. We have a very good project for women. I am a director of women, and sorry to talk about it, but it is a concrete example to see how digital can improve economical empowerment. We had now in Morocco, we have a governmental plan, what is Morocco Temkin, that means empowerment. And we had identified one of the 5 pillars of this plan is the digital as to access to infrastructure, but to use it as a tool and as a solution to have access to opportunities, economical opportunities, and to have agency for women, women in vulnerable situation. That is some examples for Morocco, Casablanca, Marrakesh, and Rabat that are champions at this level for access to digital, but the use of digital to access to some platforms, as I said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Governor, would you like to build on that?
Sí, yo creo que las alianzas público-privadas y aún mucho más la unión de todos los actores de la sociedad son absolutamente trascendentales para cualquier verdadera transformación, avance de una sociedad. Y en el campo, digamos, de las tecnologías y digital, muchísimo más intensamente. Esa ha sido, por ejemplo, una de los factores claves de la transformación y el avance de Medellín en los últimos 20, 25 años. Nosotros tenemos en Medellín digamos, una institucionalidad reunida a través de una mesa conjunta de universidad, empresa y Estado. Y esto no fue ni siquiera creado o estimulado únicamente por el sector público, sino que fue una especie de encuentro natural de las 3 sectores o áreas. Y lleva más de 15, 18 años con reuniones, esa mesa, periódicas, absolutamente disciplinadas, cada mes, tocando integralmente los temas de la ciudad. Y de allí, por ejemplo, y también obviamente con el liderazgo de la alcaldía de Medellín de la época, se creó, por ejemplo, el sistema o el ecosistema de innovación de la ciudad, que tiene, entre otras, mucha, digamos, similitud y hermandad con el @22 de aquí de Barcelona. El nuestro se denomina Ruta N, y es uno de esos ejemplos concretos en términos de tecnología y en términos de desarrollo digital de la alianza universidad, empresa, Estado en Medellín.
I think it's amazing when you see most cities that have really, truly transformed themselves. You know, it's very much involved working with multiple stakeholders collectively to develop a shared vision. Renata, would you like to comment further? And I'm conscious that we have very little time, so I'm going to ask both of our speakers to be concise so I get a question from the audience.
Commenting on specifically on
these
alliances?
How the public sector, the private sector, civil society, and academia can form new partnerships, how they can more effectively work together.
The problem that we often have is that there's no equal footing for civil society. So usually, the government has the power, the private sector has the leverage. I mean, the leverage of also some degree of money and power. And citizens are not necessarily at the same level, And sometimes when this kind of alliances are, if you don't enable and if you do not create the basic literacies and allocate the support necessary for citizens to have a meaningful participation, then it falls apart. Because this is a very good example, for example, of good, healthy practice. But I have seen a lot happening in cities when digitization is being discussed, where, of course, citizens are not given enough information, deals are made in closed rooms, and it is just it looks like participatory, it looks like a happy picture with all the members of the family, but in reality it's not. So specifically, when you think about surveillance technologies, when you think about artificial intelligence and automation for social protection systems, we need to elevate civil society really and to give them meaningful access to all relevant information of everything that is going on and a right to stop the tech projects, if they detect some, exclusion by design or violations of privacy by default.
We've seen that in Toronto last year, didn't we? Jeremy, any thoughts? How can we better work together? Excellent.
I'll be very concise. 4 things, all tied to public, private, nonprofit, civil society coming together, academia coming together to help government in the context of what you described around fiscal constraints and issues in particular. The first, I believe, is really on training, right? Government, technologists, and others benefit greatly, significantly from eyes on glass, fingers on keyboards training of the government workforce. At the same time, academic institutions, nonprofits, and government and private sector benefit from new insights through those trainings, right, and opportunities. The second I would look at is around the future of the way that we work. Hybrid work, distributed work, the government workforces that are coming back to the office for days during the week versus every day of the week. What are new business models, new approaches to the ways that government, public, private sector can all kind of come together and think through the future of the way that the government workforce delivers services for people. The third that I would point out here is around security and digital transformation. We've talked about this quite a bit, at least the digital transformation pieces, but due to the pandemic and the rapid clip by which applications were deployed during those times, it's often a question mark, and a reality that a lot of the security reviews and approaches to the ways that products were delivered did not go through that rigorous review. So I look at that as an opportunity to consider, because keeping privacy, citizen data secure, figuring out ways that these 3 parties can come together to really tackle these issues around how do we balance digital transformation and the cybersecurity needs, which are at risk when those systems are not secure. And finally, the fourth is on a partnership that we developed with G3 ICT and the World Economic Forum, which is about more inclusive procurement practices and technologies and programs, something that we launched with the City of Los Angeles and Mayor Garcetti's office just a few weeks back, looking at the way that this is not only making sense from a budgetary perspective for cities, but also to that point around accessibility, ethical approaches to make sure that we're developing and procuring technologies that are for all.
Thank you very much. And further information is available on the G20 Smart Cities Alliance. Does anybody have any questions in the audience? I see somebody with their hand up. If you'd like to say who you are, where you're from, and who your question is directed towards.
Yes, thank you. I'm Amber Johnson, and I'm coming from the US originally. I honestly could direct it to anyone, just whoever has the most quickest insight. Thank you so much. I'm just very curious, as we've talked about these individuals that are often underrepresented and how we can include their voices in the decision-making process during the transition for digital. But I'm mostly interested in what are we doing to try to fight to break down those barriers or create incentives for regular people who have these interests, who need to, they have the needs that need to be met. So how are we bringing them in and helping them actually be a part of decision making? Thank you.
Great question. Directed towards anyone in particular or everyone? Everyone. Who would like to start? Who would like to take that? Jeremy.
Appropriate.
Fatima?
I think I just spoke, so I don't want to keep talking. But I really think it's the points that Renata brought up around making sure that citizen voices, resident voices, people are at the table, right? They're part of not only the discussion, they're part of the solution side of this and solving the problems. Because ultimately, when you are looking at a policy issue or a new project, and you're intending to deliver that project in a neighborhood, in a community, ultimately what happens, right, if citizen voices and people are not at the table, that project is not going to survive, in my opinion. You have to have the community and the people at the table to co-create the solution, to be a part of it, to manage it, and own it, because otherwise it's a very top-down approach to the way that decisions are made. Yeah.
Any other thoughts, Renata?
I think that it's, when to participate in digital, it's better to show and not tell. And I have seen a lot of very exciting projects with Internet of Things and sensors. When you deliver technologies to the communities that they can create and do things that are meaningful for them. For example, measuring the quality of air, or measuring water, or when you incorporate them into the technology, into the solutions that will shape and improve their quality of life. If not, if it's just talking, it will be like the three people with a lot of time attending all the meetings, and that's not meaningful participation. I think that you have to go to the neighborhoods, plug the technologies in, and show that the possibilities of those technologies, to understand how it works, how it can impact your life, your daily life for good.
Allow citizens to experience, you're saying. Yeah. Governor, any final thoughts?
Un concepto en esa dirección. La participación ciudadana es la base de un buen gobierno. Nosotros en Antioquia, por ejemplo, y en clave de esa participación ciudadana, estamos hoy en día en una gran discusión para construir lo que denominamos Agenda Antioquia 2040, la visión de nuestro departamento hacia el 2040. Y esto nos ha llevado al ejercicio más amplio, más intenso de participación ciudadana de la historia de nuestro departamento. Hemos avanzado en más de 1.320 talleres participativos en todo el departamento, y en forma directa preguntándole a los ciudadanos para que, como tiene que ser, ellos sean los que decidan el sueño común de la Antioquia del 2040. Pero en este año 2022, vamos a avanzar el próximo año ya en la parte final de la Agenda 2040, utilizando, entre otras, las herramientas tecnológicas para acercarnos cada vez más a todos los ciudadanos del departamento, de modo que nos puedan participar en esa agenda. Nuestro objetivo, y aquí me acompaña la directora de la Agenda 2040 para Antioquia, mañana tendrá una presentación aquí sobre Agenda 2040 en Smart City, es muy ambicioso y es tratar que de una u otra forma los 6,5 millones de antioqueños participen en esa construcción de la visión del departamento, pero no solo de la visión, sino de la agenda, que sean las herramientas, los proyectos, los programas, los principios, las metas, los indicadores, para ir en esa dirección hacia ese objetivo.
Super important point, the importance of bringing the citizens in early into the discussion. Fatima, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, thank you. Just to give you two examples, for Morocco, we have a law what allows to civil society to give some motion and petitions. And it is organized in this organic law. And we had made a lot of communication and sensitization actions to allow civil society to propose some laws or some any revision of something in Morocco. And it is the first example. The second example is the platform of the e-government, open government. That is, we launched 2 years ago a large consultation, and every citizen in Morocco had the possibility to ask the government and to propose, and this is a very, very good practice in Morocco, this large consultation. And now the government, every department has to be, has some accountability against those propositions and to answer for each problem with the program and concrete action in the territorial level. And due to this platform, the e-government, we had an award this year, and we are very, very happy for this platform in Morocco.
Thank you very much for that, Fatima. I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists for their contribution. I'd like to thank you, our audience, who are joining us here in person and indeed at home. I'm just going to finish with a quote by the Secretary General of the United Nations. He said, "Digital inclusion will be essential to building a strong recovery in the post-pandemic world. With the digital divide starker than ever today, we must work and partner with a variety of stakeholders to power an inclusive future for all." So I hope we all practice that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.